Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath with Forbes Breaking News. Mediators from the U.S., Egypt, and Qatar have met in Doha today to avert a wider crisis in the Middle East. Here to explain exactly what is going on is Stephen A. Cook. He's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Stephen, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure.
It seems like developments are developing literally minute by minute. What do we know right now about relations between Israel and Iran and the broader Middle East?
Yeah, so what's happening now is a lot of maneuvering, a lot of positioning. The most important thing that's happening are these ceasefire negotiations that are happening in Doha, the capital of Qatar. The Israelis are there, the Egyptians are there, the Qataris are obviously there, and the Americans are there. What's missing is Hamas, although they're not totally missing because they're based in Doha. There's been no major breakthrough, but there are some signs, despite all of the negativity and skepticism, there are some signs that they might be getting somewhere. First, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel sent his negotiating team with a slightly broader mandate than they had before, which is significant because he kept them really on a tight leash before. And now they have a little bit more room to run in terms of agreeing to things. And although Hamas is not attending these talks per se, they are in Doha and they have asked to be briefed on development. So there does seem to be the possibility of some movement, but there are a lot of reasons to remain skeptical that we'll get a ceasefire. And how this plugs into the Iran situation is there is the idea, I think this is mostly an American idea, that if you get the ceasefire between the Israelis and Hamas in Gaza, it will mitigate, not completely get rid of, but mitigate the risk of a broader conflict between Israel and Iran and Israel and Hezbollah. That's the working theory here. The Iranians have sort of fed into this, saying they'll do nothing to undermine ceasefire talks. I'm actually skeptical of both. I'm skeptical that there will be a ceasefire, and I'm skeptical that the Iranians will keep their powder dry, as they say.
Let's get into the why of both. And let's start with your skepticism on ceasefire. Why do you think that is unlikely at this point in time?
Well, there's a lot of details that the two sides don't agree on, but I think that there's a broader macro issue here, and that is that the leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, doesn't want a ceasefire. He thinks he's winning. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel is dependent upon parties for the stability of his coalition government who also don't want a ceasefire and threaten to bolt from the government if there is a ceasefire. And so take those two things together, and I don't see where there is actually a touch point that the two sides can agree on. What we're seeing here is Sinwar and Hamas, who are one-staters, pitted against the one-staters of the Israeli government who want to see the eradication of Hamas. How we think we're going to get these two sides to actually agree, you could, in theory, get Netanyahu and the security establishment in Israel to agree to a deal, but because Prime Minister Netanyahu is worried about his political future, he doesn't want to undermine his coalition. And of course, Hamas is now lined up behind Yahya Sinwar, who is the most hardline of hardline. So that's one real reason to be very skeptical of this. And then there are details that the two sides just don't agree on. There is this question of who controls the border between Gaza and Egypt. This was quite clearly the resupply line for Hamas. It's not only the place where humanitarian aid would come across, but also underneath there were massive tunnels that were dug that were where Hamas was supplied with weaponry or the means to build their own weaponry in the battle against Israel. And then, of course, the Israelis have a demand. And so the Israelis obviously don't want to give that up. This is a way to squeeze Hamas. But the Egyptians and the Palestinians are saying, no, the Israelis cannot be on this border. And then there's the problem of the Israelis are demanding that no armed cadres be allowed back into the northern Gaza Strip. And Hamas has not agreed to that. And then there's the issue, Hamas says the war has to come to an end with the ceasefire. And the Israelis say, we decide when the war comes to an end. So there are all of these problems. And, the Biden administration keeps saying, we're close, we're close, we're close, but some details need to be ironed out. Well, if these are in fact the details that need to be ironed out, we're not as close as the White House would like us to believe.
I was just about to ask, what is the Biden administration's position here? You mentioned the US is observing, and I guess a second part to that question, to piggyback off what you just said, why are they saying we're close if in fact the details are as complicated as what you have just outlined?
Yeah, the United States has been fully engaged and fully involved in these ceasefire negotiations from the very beginning, going back to last fall, in the person of CIA Director Bill Burns, who's not just a spy master, but also has a long history in the Middle East as a diplomat. And he's very, very well respected. So if anybody can pull this rabbit out of a hat, it will be Bill Burns. And so this round of negotiations, in fact, the United States is not just involved in passing messages and offering advice. It, along with its Egyptian and Qatari partners, are providing what diplomats call bridging proposals. So saying, hey, there's a difference here between the Israelis and Hamas. Here's our own proposal for how you overcome that obstacle. So that's what's happening in the actual room where they're negotiating right now. Once again, it strikes me that these differences are a lot bigger than the administration is letting on. And it's almost as if the United States wants the ceasefire more than the parties do, but the parties don't want to be blamed for undermining or tanking a ceasefire that they actually really don't want, which is one of these kind of weird, odd, surreal things that happens in these types of negotiations.
Interesting. Do you think the 2024 presidential election plays into the American urge for a ceasefire deal, or is that coming from protests that we've seen on the ground at campuses and across the country? What's driving the US's position here and the Biden administration's position here?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, you cannot look at the situation in Gaza and not understand the suffering of Palestinians there. There's a lot of dispute over the actual numbers of Palestinians who have been killed, regardless of what the numbers. It's too many, and Palestinians have suffered tremendously. And yes, the United States has been roiled by these images coming out of Gaza. You also can't help but feel sympathy for the Israelis, particularly the hostage families. And so there's that kind of urge just at the humanitarian level, and the White House, which has fully backed Israel, though also has assessed at a military level, the Israelis have done so much damage to Hamas that Hamas cannot undertake the kind of attack that it did on October 7th and the massacre of up to 1,200 people, mostly civilians. And so that it's not really worth it for the IDF to continue its military operations in the Gaza Strip. And now is really a time for a ceasefire. Everybody will benefit from the ceasefire. The poor Palestinians will benefit, and the families of hostages, at least those who are alive, will benefit from a ceasefire. And I think that's really what's motivating it. Undoubtedly the case that there are people in the United States who are very unhappy with the Biden administration's approach to the conflict. You had a large block of uncommitted voters in places like Michigan and Minnesota. I suspect, though, that the presidential election won't turn on a foreign policy issue. Americans generally don't vote on a foreign policy issue. So, but this has absolutely roiled the Democratic Party in particular, and is part of the way in which at least the party is approaching its coming convention.
I was just about to ask if this ceasefire deal, or if these ceasefire discussions today are not successful, as you suspect, how will that affect presidential candidate Vice President Harris and her policy platform here?
Yeah, I like to stick to policy rather than politics, so I'm going to be very, very careful here. I think that no ceasefire is not likely to impact her campaign per se, or her approach. Of course, the vice president hasn't really articulated a foreign policy vision, or hasn't really distanced herself other than in slight tone when it comes to the war in the Gaza Strip. And I don't think that if there is a ceasefire, it will necessarily reduce the tension between uncommitted voters who are vowing to make themselves heard at the DNC convention, which is coming up in a couple of days, or protesters outside of the venue. I think that there's the 10 months of war and the 10 months of U.S. policy will not suddenly go away if there's a ceasefire. But of course, the ceasefire is something that is good for Israelis as well as Palestinians.
Good for humans. I want to get back to, you had two areas of skepticism, one around the success of these ceasefire deals and the other around how much a ceasefire would avert a wider conflict between Israel and Iran. Can you just give us a brief 30-second overview for folks who didn't see the headlines earlier this month? Why is there a concern about a broader conflict between Israel and Iran?
Well, I can do both at the same time, actually, so it'll be really quick. The Israelis are suspected, and I think it's a good suspicion, to have killed a leader of Hamas, one of the leaders of Hamas, in a guest house in Tehran on the occasion of the new Iranian president's inauguration. This was bold, to say the least, and immediately resulted in the Iranian leadership vowing revenge against Israel. Iran, of course, a sponsor of Hamas. This was very, very embarrassing for the Iranian regime. This inauguration was to celebrate Hamas and other members of the so-called Axis of Resistance and their military successes against Israel over the course of these last 10 months. And here, ostensibly, the Israeli Mossad was able to assassinate this guy right under the noses of the Iranians. So that's why there's a real concern that there will be an intensification of the regional conflict. This happened a number of weeks ago. And so some of the current thinking is that the Iranians have been deterred by both the Israelis and a buildup of American forces in the Middle East. I think that they may have been deterred for the moment, but the Iranians are not going to let this pass. This was, as I said, bold and deeply embarrassing for them. And they have put themselves in a position where they're going to have to respond in some way, shape, or form, and it's going to have to be punishing. So even if that has not happened immediately, I think it's likely to happen sooner rather than later.
That's a little scary. What do you expect that retaliation would look like?
Well, lots of people are focusing on what happened last April when the Iranians fired 300 missiles and drones at Israel. I don't think that it's likely to come like that. You know, people are always fighting the last war. And there are a lot of options for the Iranians. They have what's called the Axis of Resistance, Hezbollah, which is part of the Axis of Resistance, which is a Lebanese militant organization, has an arsenal of anywhere from 130,000 to 150,000 rockets and precision-guided munitions that can do a lot of damage to Israel. So Hezbollah, in combination with the Iranians' own missiles and rockets. Then, of course, there are the Houthis from Yemen who have been constantly firing on Israel since the early days of this conflict. And then, of course, I think something that people haven't thought about is the fact that the Iranians have been pouring weapons and money into the West Bank through Syria for many, many months, even before October 7th, and have the ability to raise a storm of violence there, which is why the IDF, Israel Defense Forces, has not only been battling Hamas in the Gaza Strip, but they've been fighting what is essentially a low-intensity conflict in the West Bank and arresting hundreds, thousands of people to prevent that kind of thing from happening. So there are lots of possibilities for the Iranians. They can strike Israel proper. They can strike Israeli interests abroad, which they've done before. It's coming. Something ugly is coming, even with the demonstration of American force and the Israeli threat to preempt an Iranian attack.
You mentioned at the top of the conversation that the idea that a ceasefire talk or a ceasefire deal would avert a conflict between Israel and Iran is an American idea. So what is the American media and public focusing on, and what are we missing? What should we be paying attention to that we are not, in your view?
Yeah, I think it is interesting how people have taken up this idea that a ceasefire will diminish the possibility of a region-wide conflict. And I think something that is important for American audiences to remember is that the Iranians and their axis of resistance have been preparing for this conflict for quite some time. This is, in ways, this is a conflict that they have wanted. And the Israelis have also been preparing for this conflict. And in ways, what's happened since October 7th is payback for a lot of the damage that the Israelis have been doing to the Iranians in what, in the previous almost decade has been referred to as the shadow war between the two countries. I don't see that this is going to come to an end anytime soon. And we can talk about ceasefires. Perhaps we might get one at some time in the future, but the appetite for this conflict is now it has not been diminished. In fact, the events of October 7th and since have only kind of fueled the desire on the part of the parties to continue the fight. In Israel, there was an interesting poll the other day. A majority of Israelis are supportive of widening the conflict into southern Lebanon. They want to take it to the Iranians. They see the Iranians as directing this conflict against them. So this isn't done with a ceasefire, and this is a conflict that I think is going to go on for some time.
If you were to put this moment in time in context over the last 10, 20, 50 years, is there an analogy? How would you contextualize what we are seeing this month, this week, this day?
Immediately after the October 7th attacks, there was lots of talk of the October 1973 war, and this being similar, the surprise attack, the Israelis caught off guard. I think that analogy worked for some time, for a short period of time, but we're sort of in unprecedented waters here. Unprecedented, is that a good metaphor? We're in an unprecedented moment in the Middle East, in the sense that, one, Israel is essentially battling non-state actors, which are much, much more difficult to deal with. Two, they've been fighting a war for 10 months, something Israel has never done. This is the longest war in Israel's history and goes against all of their military doctrine. And three, what's interesting is that the Arab states aren't involved. These are non-state actors in Arab countries and the Iranians. So this is something we have not seen before, both in the Middle East, and also the political fallout of it here in the United States or in Europe are things that we have never seen before. And I think they're reflective of a changing politics of the Middle East in the United States.
Obviously, things on the ground are moving very quickly. As I said at the beginning, the developments are developing on a minute-by-minute basis. But Stephen, what will you...
Welcome to my life.
I was just about to say, what are you watching? What else will you be paying attention to in the coming days and weeks?
The key figures that I look at and will be looking for in the coming days is, what is Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, doing? And what are Netanyahu's partners, coalition partners to the right of him, what are they doing? I think they're critical to what will happen next in the region. And when it comes to the Iranians, I'm just waiting for them to respond, because I'm almost certain that they will. I know that's dangerous for an analyst to say something like that, but I don't think, given the affront of the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, I don't think they can let it pass.
And what does that mean for Americans who are hearing these headlines, and you're saying, Iran is likely to retaliate? What does that mean for day-to-day news watchers?
Well, I think a couple of things. One, the Iranians do have the capability to mess around with freedom of navigation in and around the Middle East, and that means the free flow of energy resources, which means that Americans may be affected in terms of what they pay at the pump to fill up their cars. The other thing, and I think a more immediate one, is that the United States has sent large numbers of forces into the region to try to deter the Iranians. But not only are they trying to deter the Iranians by this demonstration of force, there's also an implicit threat there that the Iranians will suffer a terrible blow should they directly attack Israel and cause a lot of damage. That means, once again, American forces engaged in hostilities in the Middle East, something that hasn't been the case for 3 years.
Those are some sobering predictions, but we thank you nonetheless for sharing them with us. We hope to have you back in the future.
I'm sorry to be a bummer.
War and conflict it kind of comes with the territory that you study, unfortunately.
Unfortunately. Thanks very much.